Well, good evening. My name is Jens Hoffmann. I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Exhibitions and Public Programs here at the Jewish Museum. I'd like to welcome all of you on this rainy afternoon. I was kind of worried that actually nobody would make it. I almost didn't make it because I was stuck midtown and there weren't any cars available. This is the second in a series of public programs that we have organized around the exhibition of Jack Goldstein that I hope all of you have seen. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Douglas Crimp here tonight, who's sitting here with me on stage. Welcome. Douglas Crimp began teaching on the faculty of the Visual and Cultural Studies program at the University of Rochester at the Department of Art and Art History in 1992 and was appointed the Fanny Knapp Allen Professor of Art History in 2003. He received his PhD in art history at the Graduate Center and the City University of New York. Between 1977 and 1990, he was an editor of the journal October. Recently, he curated mixed-use Manhattan photography and related practices, 1970s to the present, an exhibition about the uses of pictures made in New York City, beginning with the deindustrialization in the 1970s. This was presented at the Museum Reina Sofia in Madrid. Crimp is also the author of On the Museum Ruins and Melancholia and Moralism, essay on AIDS and queer politics. He recently published a book on the films of Andy Warhol and is currently working on his memoir titled Before Pictures, which kind of brings us directly to the theme of our conversation. Douglas also organized, sort of his legendary exhibition, Pictures, which took place in 1977 at Artist Space, and has actually been restaged once at Artist Space in 2001, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art made a show that was sort of based on that show and artists that were coming out of the circuit of the artists that were in the original show. So tonight we were thinking about kind of splitting the conversation into parts. The first part, we wanted to talk with Douglas a little bit about the work of Jack Goldstein and also the exhibition that we have on view. And in the second part, go and talk perhaps a little bit more about the exhibition Pictures and the legacy of that. Before we begin our official sort of part, we both were sitting down there and I said, like, how is it, how do you feel being associated with this particular exhibition now, and I was saying, well, you must have spoken about this 100 times. I hope this is still interesting to you, and so I don't know. Perhaps we could begin with that.
Oh, that's a huge subject. It's something very well. First of all, I think maybe I could say that the Pictures exhibition. You have the catalog here. It was a very small exhibition. It had 5 artists in it.
People don't make catalogs like these anymore. No. Very modest, nice, and a precious object. And
and actually, that catalog is still available. I don't know why, but it seems that Helene Weiner, who was the director of Artist Space at the time, figured that a large print run didn't cost that much more than a small print run, so there must be thousands of them. They still have boxes of them at Artist Space. But it was, it was a small exhibition in an alternative space in Tribeca, which nevertheless was an alternative space that around which there was a very large community of younger artists, younger than me mostly, and they were artists that Helene Weiner was exhibiting, and then artists who were also friends with those artists and so on. So it was a place around which there was a kind of specific, I think you could say, a specific kind of aesthetic practice that was new in the mid-'70s when Helene began as director there. And Helene asked me to curate it. Helene and I were friends, and we had done some projects together. She asked me to put together an exhibition and to write a catalog, and it was the first catalog that Artist Space ever had published. And it was the first curated show as such, I think, as well. So I suppose that the fact that it was a curated show, that it had a catalog, and I suppose the fact that I wrote, I attempted to explain to myself, as well as to readers of the catalog, what I thought what seemed like a new tendency in art was about. There was a kind of buzz around this exhibition because of the community of people who had gathered around this alternative space. And then there were sort of other exhibitions that followed upon it that in some ways repeated it, I think. And then this was 1977, in September was the exhibition. I had begun as the managing editor of October earlier that year, in the beginning of the summer. And because of the buzz around the exhibition and the interest in the catalog essay, my boss at the time, Ralston Krauss, suggested that we republish the essay in October. This was maybe a year later, and at that point I didn't feel, I felt that the essay in the catalog was a kind of, I was coming to terms with the work and coming to terms also with the kind of post-structuralist theory that I was reading at the time and applying to the work. I wasn't entirely satisfied with it, so I actually rewrote the essay rather completely. And it was that version of the essay, which was then published in 1979 in October, that was much more widely read and much more widely distributed and republished, reprinted in various places, including an important collection of art critical writing from the 80s that was edited by Brian Wallace. All of these things together conspire to, and then also the fact that a number of the artists in the exhibition went on to have rather stellar careers, that conspired to make this exhibition a kind of historic event. And all I can tell you is that it is extremely strange to be historicized, to read about, to continuously read over time the way something that I was involved with gets written about and thought about and argued about. But, you know, I try in some ways to take a distance on that and to just be, I mean, of course I'm invested in it because it's something that I did, but I'm also less invested than I might be simply because I've done a lot of other things, and I moved very quickly after the pictures exhibition to other interests and began writing about many different kinds of things. So it's a little uncanny, actually, to always be associated with that very specific moment in my work. Although I will say that probably there is a second moment that came to displace it for many people, and that was the publication in 1987, so 10 years later, of the special issue of October on AIDS.
Yeah. You mentioned the catalog quite a bit, and one thing I noticed was that nowhere in the catalog would it say that this exhibition was curated by Douglas Crimp, the way that you would find this in almost every publication for an exhibition today, even for monographic exhibitions. You would find the name of curated by. I just looked at it and I couldn't see that. Was that a kind of new idea at that point, the idea of thinking about exhibitions that way, or how was curating seen at that particular point?
It doesn't occur to me that it was particularly different. In fact, I didn't realize that it didn't say that either. I suppose the fact that I signed the essay was enough.
No, of course, yeah.
No, I don't think. I mean, certainly, I began my immediately after college, began working at the Guggenheim Museum as a curatorial assistant to Diane Waldman, and certainly the exhibitions that Diane curated were associated with her. So I think curators had very much the same status as now. There weren't university programs to train curators, I think, the way there are now.
Jack Goldstein has a very central position, I think, in pictures. You begin your essay with him, and he comes up again and again, almost as the most central figure in the essay and in the exhibition. And at one point you talk about meeting with him in his studio and working with him on the film The Ballet Shoe. And I wonder, how was it to work with him, and how did you get to know him? Where did you guys first meet?
Well, this Jens is referring to the essay that I wrote for the Catalogue of the Present exhibition. And actually, I should say that when I talk about working with him on the film A Ballet Shoe, it's specifically a false memory. I mean, it's a misremembering. There's something in my, I relay this sense that, or a memory of Jack making a film and wanting to use my hands, and when the camera starts rolling, my hands start to shake, and therefore it ruins the film. And I associate that memory with the film A Ballet Shoe. You can maybe put a...
I think we saw that before somewhere. Wait a second. This is it.
So yeah, those are in my memory are my hands, but it's not. It didn't happen because I think it didn't happen. This is all about the fact that I'm perfectly aware, as I work on a memoir, that my memory is not very good of this period, and that I cannot therefore be the truthful witness to these events. And I use that in the essay in the current catalog because in the return at present to artists of that time, or to that moment historically, there is a kind of, there is this particular instance of a kind of oral history of that period, or of Jack Goldstein's career, which is the book called Jack Goldstein and the Calarts Mafia, which is entirely interviews with Jack. It's mostly long interviews with Jack, and interviews with various of his colleagues, peers as artists, curators, and so on. And it seemed to me that, Jack also reports a memory of me, and it seemed to me that is not the way that I want to do history of that period. My own sense of how, or of any period, my own sense of how we might approach Jack Goldstein is by attending carefully to his work. And the book, Jack Goldstein and the Calarts Mafia, almost doesn't deal with the work at all. It deals with careers and competitiveness and settling scores of various kind, and it also, because of Goldstein's suicide shortly after that, he finished that book, and before it was published. And because of his disappearing from the art world for a period of time and his rediscovery, we have now a kind of mythological figure of the romantic artist in Jack Goldstein. And I, in writing this piece, wanted to actually not contribute to the mythologization of Jack Goldstein, but rather to be more attentive to the work and why we might find it, why we perhaps found it interesting then, but more importantly, why we find it interesting now.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the work. You also stated in the essay that when you saw the films for the very first time, you felt like there was something like that you've never seen before. Can you describe this a little bit more, elaborate a little bit more? What was so special about them? I remember also Robert Longo saying that his very first show that he ever did was also with Jack, and that he saw Loop, and for a number of days he would just see that film again and again and again. Loop is a film that you see first when you enter the galleries downstairs.
No, it's The Jump.
I'm sorry. Jump on a Loop.
Yeah. Well, I attempt to approach this a bit also in my essay. First of all, my experience of film in art galleries, one didn't experience film in art galleries very much at that time. There were artists who were making films. A lot of artists turned to making films in the late 60s and early 70s. And Castelli and Sonnabend actually had a distribution company to distribute artist films, because many of the artists represented by those two galleries were making films. But one did not see them projected in galleries as one does now. One saw them in theaters, or perhaps, but there wouldn't, I mean, we see Jack Goldstein's films now projected as loops in the galleries. But loopers, although they had been used by Paul Scherritz in his gallery work in the mid-70s, he jerried us. My understanding that the only loopers that existed at that time were for peep shows, and you couldn't go and buy a looper. I mean, you still can't go and buy a looper. You actually have to have them constructed,
custom made, yeah,
and they're extremely expensive. So when I was used to seeing films, independent filmmakers like Hollis Frampton or Michael Snow at Anthology Film Archives particularly, and some other independent venues, or screenings of the films by artists that were being made at that time. I was not used to thinking about seeing films in galleries, and in fact, it should be said that when we showed Jack Goldstein's films at Artist Space in the picture show, you simply had to request that they be threaded onto the projector and projected for you. So I saw these films because, well, you asked me in what circumstances I saw them and how I got to meet Jack. First of all, I think it should be said that Jack, so far as I recall, did not have a studio. He was, after all, trained in John Baldessari's post-studio program, and the whole idea was that in the production of post-studio art, you didn't need a studio, because if you think about the kind of work that Jack Goldstein was making at this time, he wasn't making it in a studio. He was having it made in the film industry in Hollywood, or the record pressing industry, and the kind of work that was shown in pictures was not something that he found. I mean, he didn't in any case fabricate his own work, never, even when he made paintings. So in that sense, well, when he made paintings, he got a studio because he had his assistants come and fabricate them in his studio as he directed them. But when I knew him, I think he had simply a loft that he lived in. I knew him as, I was close friends with Helene Weiner, and Helene and Jack were a couple, and I knew Jack as Helene's partner. He showed me his films. I mean, he projected them like in their loft, for me to see. And I suppose what was astonishing about them, that they were so short. I don't think that I had not seen Warhol's portrait films at that time, so I hadn't seen a 4-minute film. And some of Jack Goldstein's films are extremely short. That is, they're a few seconds. And when you don't see them looped, or when you don't see them in succession the way you see them here, but you thread them on a projector, you project them, and the film goes by, like that, it's not like an experience of film that I had ever had. It was more like looking at a photograph or a still picture, but one that slightly moved. That some, like the event of a ballet shoe, for example, is simply the ballerina, the hands untying, pulling the ribbon that unties the bow, and the ballerina like 8 seconds, and that's the entire film. So it's certainly not a narrative, and it is essentially a kind of picture, and a very highly produced picture, one which is it's not haphazard in any way, and it doesn't feel appropriated. It feels extremely carefully constructed. And I think I simply had never seen anything remotely like that on film. Even in the one truly appropriated image, which was the MGM lion, the fact that it was only that, only a logo, was something extremely new to me. And so I guess that I could say that Jack's films at that time were like the other things that I showed, that were, I was used to looking at abstract art for the most part, and minimal art and post-minimal art, which is what I had been interested in, and then performance. I was very interested in, I had the text that I wrote before I did the picture show. The last thing that I had published, and I hadn't published much at this point anyway, was for a special issue of Studio International on performance art, and I wrote an essay on Joan Jonas's performances, and particularly her video performances. So I was very interested I was looking at a lot of performance work at the time. And then suddenly I was looking at these younger artists who were dealing with representation in a different way than I had ever experienced representational work.
Well, you just mentioned performance, and when we go through the exhibition after we see Jump, we begin sort of at the beginning of his career, and there is this remake of this sort of minimal, post-minimal looking sculpture, and then across from that is a series of films that are performances that he did very early on. And I'd never seen them before I saw this exhibition in Orange County, and I was very surprised about this because they reminded me a lot of other work that was done in the area of performance art, particularly in California. What do you think have been influences on Jack's work in that particular period? I mean, you mentioned Baldessari, and I know of Baldessari doing similar films early on in his career, or also Bruce Nauman working in his studio. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was that this sort of aggressivity that I feel takes place in a lot of his work is already visible there when he screams Jack, 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 or he jumps around the plates that then fall over, or hammers on the table until the glass of milk falls over.
Mm. Well, I should say first of all that I don't recall seeing these films. I don't think Jack showed me these films, or I didn't know the work that Jack had done before he came to New York. So I'm seeing them for the first time as well.
Really?
And I guess it's possibly I had conversations with Helene and Jack about his earlier work, but I don't really recall it, and I certainly didn't make, if I did if I did have those conversations, I didn't make anything of it in my writing about the work at the time. So I suspect that I didn't. I mean, since I really was interested in, and I make the argument in both of the pictures essays that these picture makers were influenced by performance, and that performance art, and that they were somehow distilling the kind of psychological affect of a lot of performance art into a picture. I saw that eventually in Cindy Sherman's work, in Robert Longo's work. So I wasn't aware of it at the time, but certainly it is work that is reminiscent of, say, Vito Acconci's work that I knew from that period. And that's work that Baldessari would have introduced his students at Calarts.
Well, I remember the one performance, I think we had a picture of this year performance at Calarts, which is a poster that he made as an announcement for a performance where he was burying himself in the parking lot of Calarts. And this really, absolutely reminds me, of course, of someone like Chris Burden, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
Sort of a very physical, threatening situation. To me, somehow, there's also a bit of a number of paradox in the work. On the one hand, he seems extremely precise and controlled about what he's doing, and then at the other hand, there's this idea of floating, of free fall, of chance, of not being able to actually control one's destiny in a certain way. I don't know if you could maybe talk a little bit about this sort of paradox.
Yeah,
I also feel the same thing with this aggressivity that I already spoke about, the competitiveness when you think about certain performances, the boxers fighting, the fencers fighting, and then this incredible sensitivity at the same time, fragility that exists there.
Well, there's several, maybe to start with that. I think there is I don't know whether I want to call it aggressivity. I think, of course, he used fighters, he used boxers, but he also used a contortionist, and fencing is not necessarily aggressive. It has a kind of, it's also kind of aristocratic. But there was a threatening quality also to the. I think in the pictures essay, in one of them, I say that the various artists could be thought of as working in sort of popular film genres, and the genre that I associate Goldstein's work with is the disaster film. And because he's interested in, he uses in the sound effects of that are threatening. One of the records is called A Murder, and he used it. Of course, he appropriated the sound from the kind of sound that was used by studios in the making of films. But with regard to the question of control, I also noticed that he, in his early and very important interview with Morgan Fisher, I mentioned this in my current essay, that he uses the word control repeatedly, and I was very, very struck with that. In the work, I think you can see, in the work that I showed, certainly that period from the mid-1970s, and the performances particularly, what he's controlling is the mise en scène, and he particularly was interested in ways in which a picture can be staged or an event can be staged, so as to make it already seem a representation. And in one of my essays, in the second pictures essay, I use a quotation from Henry James from one of his ghost tales, which is the line from the Henry James story is, the presence before him was a presence. So he's playing on the contradictory meanings of presence, where that a presence is a ghost, but of course the ghost is present also, so it's both real and unreal at the same time. And that seems to me to really describe Jack Goldstein's performances. The way they were lit, the distance they were staged from the audience, made them seem, I also likened them to holograms. There's that weird, uncanny feeling of sort of seeing and not seeing at the same time. So the control was very much exerted in the creation of a picture. But then I think, yeah, there's also, in some of the pictures, there is that kind of sense of wanting to give up control entirely to float through space. But I think it might be said that there's another way of thinking about control that his work does not entail, but others of his peers did eventually, and that is not simply to control the event or the picture or the film or the painting eventually, to control the surface, what one looks at, but also, I mean, he's very, very involved in the framing of the picture, but certain of Goldstein's peers then also moved to thinking about how the work of art is controlled by its framing conditions. And interestingly, a year after the pictures exhibition, there was another exhibition with a catalog at Artist Space done by Janelle Raring, who is now the partner of Helene Weiner in the gallery Metro Pictures. And it was an exhibition of Louise Lawler, Christopher D'Arcangelo, Cindy Sherman, and I'm blanking, sorry, this is terrible. Anyway, these are artists who were interested really in the way the gallery or discourse or the museum frames the work of art. And one of the things that Janelle Raring did as a curator was to sort of cede control. So although she chose the artists, Adrienne Piper, I'm sorry, is the other artist. Yeah. She didn't install the work. She didn't choose the actual work. She chose only the artists. She didn't write an essay for the catalog. She wrote a short statement sort of saying why she was ceding the control, basically because she wanted to foreground the ways that artists were, I suppose you could say, taking control or thinking about how, maybe not taking control, but thinking about how control is taken in relation to a work of art by the way that it's spoken of, by the institutions which exchange it, by the selling of it, by, and so forth. And that's something that I think Goldstein, it's a kind of move that was made in that same generation that he did not make. So that in a way, if you read the narrative that he speaks in the oral history, Jack Goldstein and the Calarts Mafia, it's very much about a kind of sense of helplessness with regard to how his work either did or did not enter the institutions.
You mentioned also Goldstein's paintings and sort of perhaps slight shift in the practice. How did you respond to the pictures when you saw them for the first time? Were you as enthusiastic as when you saw the films?
No. But I mean, it was several years later, And you see, it was like 1980 or 81 was his first exhibition of the paintings at Metro Pictures. And I had become, as you may know, very involved in a kind of critique. I mean, not an interest in how other artists were making work that I saw as, that I read as a critique of all of the kind of traditions that were most represented by expressionist painting, by the painting that was on the ascent at that moment in the early 1980s in the gallery scene, by a kind of shift from what I saw as kind of critical practices to more marketable, more traditionally masculinist, more self-expressive works. Now, obviously, Goldstein's paintings were not those things. And I think he saw them probably as, if not critical of those things, he saw himself as, he positioned himself vis-a-vis those kinds of works, such as he would mention David Sally or Julian Schnabel, that he, in a certain sense, opposed. But I suppose I wasn't particularly taken initially by the fact of painting itself. I mean, actually, I think Philip Kaiser, who's the curator of this show, deals with this really beautifully in his catalog essay, which is about the paintings. And the title of his essay is a quotation from Jack Goldstein, which is, "Why not use it?" And he said it with relation to painting, like, why not use painting to make a picture, let's say. And Philip makes it clear in his essay that it's not quite that simple, that painting, after all, has a history, a long history. And painting had come to mean something relatively specific in the moment that Jack began to make paintings, the period in which Jack made paintings, the 13 or so years. And Philip points to a certain failure, a sort of sense that I think he also quotes Jack as saying something like that he's responsible only to his own history. And actually, Philip contests that, and I would too, that there is a wider history that we are all responsible for. We can't simply be as that solipsistic. So I think, actually, I have, in the few chances to see Goldstein's paintings more recently, I have found them considerably more interesting than I did at the time. I wasn't, during a lot of the period that he was showing, I wasn't even paying attention to art because I was so immersed in the AIDS crisis. There was a period from 1987 until about 1993 in which that's pretty much all I did.
Well, perhaps it's also the context in which you now see the pictures within the context of the retrospective, where connections are made and certain strands in the work continue within the paintings. This is certainly something that worked very well for me. But perhaps moving on from Goldstein a little bit more to the Pictures generation. We have had the Pictures generation, the exhibition at the Met. We had a retrospective of Cindy Sherman recently, Richard Prince, Sherry Levine had an exhibition a couple of years ago at the Whitney, and now the Jack Goldstein. Do you think there is a particular reason why there is such renewed interest in this particular group of artists? Or has it always been?
Well, some of them have had continuous have been continuously on pretty much everybody's radar. And Cindy Sherman would be an artist who has been very, very highly regarded from now we even are able to see the student work and how brilliant it was prior to the film stills, which she began in, 77, 78. And others of the artists, I think, have had sort of, many of them have had rather stellar careers, certainly. So it's not as if they, like Goldstein, sort of fell out of favor or sort of disappeared and are being now revived. Although certainly also the Pictures Generation show did tend to recover certain of the artists of that moment that have been less visible. I don't actually have much of an opinion about why certain historical moments get revived. After something has become a certain age, I suppose a younger generation of people are looking at it with different eyes. That's something that I experience very much as a professor with students who are working on contemporary art. And they often bring a wonderfully new perspective to it. And I think this is true of Philip, who did this show. Philip has been interested in the 80s for quite some time. He did a wonderful show in Basel when he was still at the Contemporary Art Museum in Basel about the 80s, which was already something of a kind of revisionist show. So he was kind of ahead of the game in that regard. There seems to be, I've been invited a lot to conferences lately about the 80s, and I always say, I'm sorry, I'm working on a memoir of the 70s, so I'm in the wrong decade at this point. But, Helen Molesworth did this very large exhibition about the 80s, which was also a kind of, an attempt to see the kind of antagonistic strains of art in the 80s between, on the one hand, the sort of pictures artists or the sort of post-conceptual artists or the institutional critical artists, the feminist artists, and then on the other hand, the expressionist painters, and she sort of amalgamated them in an attempt to kind of put them in a different kind of dialogue rather than an antagonistic debate as we saw it so much in the 1980s. And I still feel, I suppose, that I have some stakes in the original debates and still feel a kind of partisanship with regard to it, but certainly less so. The situation in the art world has changed radically since the 1980s. I think maybe the art of previous generations always feels ripe for a kind of return, and looking at it, I think Stuart Komar was talking to me the other night about people being interested in the B side, that is the kind of what was, sort of not as canonized in that moment, and wanting to kind of reconsider that, see why it wasn't, and perhaps say that it was even better. Or
well, I remember those kids in school, they were always saying, oh yeah, but you have to listen to the B side, and right. that was sort of also a mark of maybe having a certain knowledge about something that others didn't have.
Right.
Did it surprise you at all that that this group of artists came out of an alternative space downtown in 1977 and ends up at the Metropolitan Museum about like 35 years later?
Sure. First of all, the Pictures Generation show was, I think, the first of its kind at the Met. I don't know if, I do recall when I was first in New York, Henry Henry Geldzahler, who was then the curator of modern and contemporary art at the Met, did a huge post-1945 exhibition that came up through like pop art and minimalism. And it occupied all of the main galleries of the Metropolitan Museum, so where the European paintings are generally shown. And it was it was an extremely radical thing to see at that time. But it wasn't about a particular movement. It was about it was looking at the entire post-war period. So the Pictures Generation show was different from what the Met does. I think probably that will change now when they take over the Whitney Museum and have all of that space to do shows in. But and because of they've hired new curators to work on contemporary art. But yeah, so it was surprising, and it was actually gratifying in some ways, and at the same time it was, I wasn't entirely happy with the exhibition. I thought that I didn't think that it was very well, the work was very well displayed, and so it didn't look as, I think the work is better than that show made it look, for the most part. I think it was a question partly of space. They didn't give it enough space. And a lot of the work also is small because it was the early work of a lot of these artists, like, you know, small pictures by Jim Welling, for example. And I think they need a certain amount of, like, they can't be crowded into a room with ephemera without looking themselves a bit like ephemera, and they're not. They're, you know, I think those, for example, the aluminum series of James Welling are brilliant works of art. But they're very, very small scale, and they need to be shown in a particular way. And that's actually something that artists like Jack Goldstein were incredibly aware of, is like how something, you know, how you see, how something is framed, how something is staged, to actually make it look good. He had an incredible way of making, I don't know, a ballet shoe or a German Shepherd look good. He colored that dog gold, you know, in order to make it look gorgeous.
Well, good. I think maybe we should open up the podium and see if there's any questions from the audience for Douglas.
There's one back there.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm a PhD student studying the 1980s.
Can you speak louder, please?
Yeah, I'm currently a PhD student studying the 1980s. I was fortunate enough to hear this talk, and thank you for that. But my question is with regards to October. And my question to you is, to what extent did October's polarized discourse shape the way we look at the 1980s art scene now?
How did its polarized discourse shape the way we look?
Yeah. I mean, October had a very particular way of...
It was a very polemical journal, yes, indeed. Well, you know, I think that we can sort of return to some things that we've already spoken of a little bit, that like about the B-side, for example, that there is, I mean, Howard Singerman actually has written very, very brilliantly about this. Particularly, I mean, I've just started reading his book on Cherry Levine, but he starts with this fact that various people who you know read October, the so-called Octoberist critics, that the people who were publishing about postmodernism, that would include me and Craig Owens and Rosalind Krauss and Benjamin Buchloh and so on, from that period, have developed a certain resentment toward that particular canon and that particular set of arguments and the kind of theoretical, the theoretical sources that we were applying to contemporary art, and are wanting very much to find an alternative to that. My own, I mean, I obviously have a complicated relationship to the journal October because I was forced out of that journal in 1990 in a very brutal way. So, and I think of it as a very incredibly orthodox journal right now in a way that I think it was not in the 80s. It was a polemical journal. We certainly had very strong positions about the art that we were writing about at the time. But I think it was much more interdisciplinary and opened to much wider ranges of practice. So, for example, I mean, I became extremely interested in the films of Fassbinder at one point. And I mean, this, you know, this is not the sort of thing that is associated, I think, with what you're talking about as the kind of hardcore polemical antagonism that was fostered by October. I did a special issue on the films of Fassbinder. And so that for me is what I remember, is a certain breadth of interest and positions that I don't find in the current journal. But I certainly do find, and I also feel it myself to some degree, a kind of resentment toward the power of that group of critics and that set of positions, which seems to me have hardened a lot in the years subsequent to my leaving, frankly. I think the reason that I was pushed out, frankly, was that I was attempting to open up the journal. And it had to do a lot with the production of the AIDS issue, which was very different from anything that October had ever done. And it pushed me and my own thinking more in the direction of cultural studies and away from a kind of high modernist position, which I think the journal occupies now. But we were, after all, theorizing or attempting to theorize postmodernism, which was an opening out to a whole range of new positions and new theories. So I think it's a more complicated history than a lot of people feel that it is. And also, I don't think that, all of us spoke with the same voice, frankly. But yeah, I mean, it's for you as an art historian now, studying that to give us an interpretation of it. It's a history that is I think being written and variously written at this point. I'm sure you know you're not the only person. I mean, there are dissertations on October, actually.
Yes, yeah.
Can you say anything else about your reconsideration of his paintings, other than, I think that you said you hadn't really seen so much of his paintings at the time, but what you look at them now and what you see that maybe occurs to you or seems particularly relevant or striking?
Well, a lot of them are kind of just drop dead gorgeous. So it's maybe as simple as that. And there are, there's a kind of sublimity in them that I guess I appreciate in a way that I didn't see them before. And I would like to see more of them. I think one of the sad things about the space considerations here is that there are considerably fewer paintings, I think, than were in the original show. So I would be very gratified to see a very large exhibition of Goldstein's paintings. I didn't, unfortunately, get a chance to go to see the Orange County iteration of this show, but it had way more paintings, right?
Yeah.
And I did see the show at Venus over Manhattan, I mean, there was it was a very theatrical presentation of the paintings, but very interesting, I thought.
I think there was some more, but not way more.
Yeah,
in Orange County.
Yeah, but there could be way more, right? I mean,
well, there's many more in the publication. Yeah. I think images of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for speaking tonight. I wonder if you have revisited your conclusions about the kind of more traditional, or let's say ordained, photographic art making in the 70s and 80s.
The more traditional, like, for example, what?
Like, Goldstein.
Oh. Sure, yeah. So, like, what we used to think of as art photography.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. Yeah, I'm way more open to it at this point. I appreciate it. I suppose, again, it was a kind of, I think that, to go back to the 80s question for a moment, it was a very polemical moment, and certain things were happening that, it was after all the moment of Reagan, Thatcher, and Kohl, and a turn to the right in American politics, and what seemed like also a turn to the right in the art world. So there seemed to be enormous stakes in the kinds of arguments that we were making. And one of the things that, of course, I was particularly involved with was the sort of designation of photography, the entirety of photography as an art, and the kind of, voracious new collecting of photography by art institutions. And I was particularly, my polemic was very much against John Charkowski's view of photography. A lot of the photographers that he supported then, I would support now. I mean, I think they're way more interesting than I thought at the time. And of course, I also have come to value, a really fine vintage print. I was stupid enough about this kind of stuff to actually own Sherry Levine's and sell them, because I thought, well, they're just rephotographed photographs anyway, and so what difference does it make? But now I could kill myself for doing that. Yeah. But no, I mean, I also, since I've been in Rochester, we have the Eastman House there, and it's an institution that I love, and it doesn't have the kind of work that I supported because it can't afford it. But they bought photographs they bought Weston photographs for $25. And then when Weston died, they bought a bunch more from his son for $35. So they have a really amazing collection of classic photography. And it's an institution that also, before Charkowski, was supporting artists like Lee Friedlander and Gary Winogrand. And so I have a very different view of that now, a very different appreciation of the range of photographic practice.
Then, Dr. Brown.
So many fascinating issues have been raised in this conversation, but I was struck. I thought something really, one of the nutshell, one of the significant things that struck me was this, when you began to refer to memory and your own current work, which seemed to lead on to issues of biography, which and then from that into history
Sure. I mean, actually, I keep referring to this project as a memoir, but actually it's a kind of memoir-like project. It isn't about me, although I use it kind of arbitrarily. I mean, there's an aspect of it that is, of course, about me. I mean, it's about, because it's figured on the period, the 10 years from my arrival in New York until I did the picture show, somewhat arbitrarily, so a decade, and around events that I was involved in one way or another. And so there's a lot of anecdotal, biographical, autobiographical material in it. But it's really a critical project written from the point of view of the present, and it's very, very largely a research project. These incommensurables, Derrida and Balanchine. And that's kind of the way most of the chapters are organized. And the first one that I wrote was about Daniel Buren and Charles James, the haute couturier. So you can see it's, and there, but I'm working actually on critical issues that interest me in the present. So they are based on things that happened in the past, and I'm returning to them, but through a present lens. There's a chapter about Agnes Martin because I did an exhibition of her work in 1971 and visited her in New Mexico. But it's the essay is very largely about the film she made in 1976, which I didn't see until the present. But it's largely focused on Gabriel, the film, and other things as well. So. So you see, it's not really. I mean, yeah. I think also my. It's not that I'm not. I mean, I'm certainly interested in subjectivity, and have been for quite some time, and about a kind of subject position from which one writes. But I think that that's very different from the kind of belief in a kind of witness to a particular moment. I really don't trust, and I don't have a very good memory, I have to say, and I don't have much of an archive either. I don't have a lot of space, so I purged my files of a lot of my letters and things that could help me with this this memoir. So it's very largely a research project.
Suggestion of a critical biography as a possibility. Not what I'm seeing in terms of your own work, it's more like a Proustian work of art, really.
I don't think that biography is innately mythic, but I think that there is this, just this instance of the book about Goldstein, which it really gives us the myth of the artist. I mean, it's the ending with the suicide and the kind of, the outsider status all the way through, and it's not about the art. And I think that I'm actually, the chapter on Balanchine is about Balanchine's ballets. I mean, it is about the art, actually.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Sorry, it's about the invisibility of
the human body. It's shown fragmented, or it's shown like in the junk. It's not a physical human being that's being filmed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what to say to that. It's I don't think that Goldstein was particularly interested in the body as subject in his work. I think even though he used bodies in his performances and a little bit in the films, I think he's really interested in the picture, and only insofar as the body can be made into a representation or a pictorial can it even be there for him. He's interested in a kind of sublimity that is not usually represented by bodies, I think. So that you get this sort of, even with the performances that use bodies, not counting the really early ones, but the ones that I first encountered, an extraordinary distance from those as real bodies. I mean, they are somehow odd pictures. I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question.
Well, thank you very much for this nice time. And thanks to all of you for coming.